just published by FSG. He is joined tonight by Jeffrey Eugenides, and we can't wait to hear an exciting conversation about female friendship, language, and power, from France to colonial America to the moon, from 1775 to this very moment. I want to thank Lauren Roberts from FSG and Emily Stokes from the Paris Review for the support for this conversation. And let me now introduce you briefly to our prestigious guest. Adam Thirlwell was selected twice as one of Granta's best of young British novelists. His debut novel, Politics, took the international literary scene by storm in 2003. Since then, he has published novels including Lurid and Cute in 2016 and The Escape in 2009, and an essay on translation, The Delighted States, 2007. His work has been translated into 30 languages, and his essays appear in the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books, and he is an advisory editor of the Paris Review. His awards include the Somerset Maugham Award and the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2018, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Jeffrey Eugenides is the author of 3 novels. His first, The Virgin Suicides, published in 1993, is now considered a modern classic. Middlesex appeared in 2002, going on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, among many, many prizes. In 2011, Eugenides published The Marriage Plot, which became a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named as the best novel of that year by independent booksellers in the United States. A collection of short stories, Fresh Complaint, was published in 2017. Eugenides is a Lewis and Loretta Glucksman Professor in American Letters at NYU. His work has been translated into over 35 languages. He is a member both of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please welcome Adam and Jeffrey Eugenides.
The water was out in my building today, so I had to bathe out of a basin before I came up here. Which it was very 18th century. I thought it put me in the mood to talk to you about your book. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here. I think, Adam, you're going to read a tiny bit, and then we'll have our conversation.
Thank you so much for coming. We thought I'd begin with a completely out of context, out of sync moment, quite far into the novel, just to really confuse everybody, with a moment where the novel, which has already been quite fantastical, goes genuinely fantastical. And so it involves the heroine of the novel, who's called Celine. The next morning, as dawn slid down, Celine woke early. It seemed to her that there were small but definite changes to the way the world was looking, like different flowers in the garden and fungi. It was possible that this was simply one terrible effect of drinking too much, and so she went into the house to find some water. To her terror, the calendar on the wall in the kitchen was saying that the year was now 2251. She went back outside to tell her friends, but was interrupted by something she found in the courtyard. A construction resembling a boat, decorated with thousands of minute silver balloons. The material these balloons were made of looked soft, but when she touched it, she discovered it was oddly solid, a sort of highly flexible metal that she had never seen before. She opened up the vehicle and sat inside. Its interior was multicolored and very cute. Then, as she was about to get out, it began to float steadily up into the air. At first, she was almost delighted by this new sensation. She looked out the window at the approaching sky. Then she looked down, and in the streets were only people or just emptiness. The city had become endless, little buildings, factories, stadiums for slaloms and races, until finally she saw the fields outside the city, and the vehicle swung over many minuscule horses. She began to leave the lower atmosphere. She saw in succession the Mediterranean, then the Black Sea, followed by Iran and India, until Japan passed across the window of her rocket. And some hours later, the whole Pacific Ocean emerged, but it too disappeared and was replaced by the continent of America. She could clearly distinguish all these revolutions of the Earth, and eventually saw the Atlantic Ocean and then Europe reappearing in the window, but now could not distinguish the different countries because she was too high. All this happened very leisurely, like perhaps the time it might take to stay in bed all day reading after finishing a long project. And meanwhile, she continued to surge upwards into the glistening dark sky. But then abruptly, when it seemed that this drifting could continue indefinitely, the rocket was upturned, the way any vehicle might be upturned on a road if it went over some abandoned roadworks in the dark, and she felt herself plunging downwards. Her ears were popping and she was screaming without exactly realizing that she was screaming. Everything was incredibly strange, but the strangest was when she looked out the window and saw the moon suddenly in front of her. Its white surface, now she saw it close up, colorful and intricate. Then she looked away again because she thought that this must be impossible. At a point when the pressure and speed seemed too intense to bear, she heard a sound of a great rushing, a sudden inflation, and saw around her the silver balloons expand to a giant density, so that the airship which had been rushing downwards in headlong confusion now started to slow, and finally landed gently in an expanse of sand. She got out and looked up into the air. For a moment she felt safe because this was surely at least her world, and therefore she could somehow find her way home, until she looked up into the sky. A little planet was a faint mark in the sky, like an enlarged star. Then she realized this star was the Earth, and Celine vomited. Thank you.
When writers talk about books with each other, I've found that they tend to focus on different things than readers do sometimes. I remember when Jonathan Franzen's Crossroads came out. I was talking to the German writer Daniel Kehlmann, our mutual friend, about it. And what we talked about at first was the degree of difficulty of what he was doing. At least 2/3, if not more, of the book happens on a single day. He follows 5 different characters through that day. He has to make sure he knows what they're doing in every hour. He has to create their predicaments, and then on that scaffolding, he has to be able to support all of the exposition and backstory that he needs to tell the story. And there's a snowstorm coming, and there's just a lot of technical difficulty in doing something like that and not having it fall apart. And it was a while before Daniel and I ever talked about what the book was about. What was it about? We were just amazed at how hard that was. So I have to say that when I was reading your book, I was preoccupied by the degree of difficulty that you set yourself. Because it seems to me that you renounce most conventional means that novelists resort to. That would be a psychological presentation of character, to a certain extent a conventional plot. Verisimilitude, laws of nature, consistency of genre, like all the things that people do because it's expected and perhaps easier, you don't do. So I was amazed by that, and I wondered. I mean, first of all, you can say whether you agree that that's correct or not. But my question was that terrifying? Was it liberating? Was it both? How was it a decision that you came to before writing the book, or did it come about because of a series of decisions and maybe barriers that you had to get around?
Yeah, I think often I'm often amazed by how weird the book can end up by the time I finished it. And I think that in this case, I think a lot of things flowed from what felt like a relatively small, basically comic decision, which was, this is a novel technically set in the 18th century, And I think I have a lot of anxiety about historical fiction, about writing historical fiction. And when I was just initially playing around with the kind of idea, I think I very quickly decided that I was most comfortable the more anachronistic it became. And basically, so my sense of humor pushed this book towards a style where I just found it very interesting to try and collapse the kind of distinction between what's happening in the 18th century and what could be happening in a contemporary novel. And especially, so basically in the vocabulary, so that people message each other, scripts are in development. There's a whole way of trying to kind of find a vocabulary that would be correct for the 18th century in some way, but also completely correct for the 21st. And I think that initial decision pushed the novel into partly it did feel quite liberating, because there were suddenly certain things that I therefore could play around with, like genre, and like, so that especially because like there's this kind of moment of science fiction basically, which I think I would never have allowed myself if I hadn't already done quite a lot of playfulness with the language. But so I don't know, it's kind of, I think there was certainly a point about halfway through I got very worried, and but I think I quite enjoy that with writing. Like, I think I get bored very easily. I think
it's unavoidable too.
So yeah.
First of all, I don't want to give the impression that I think your book is weird, because people call my books weird, and I always really dislike that. I don't think it's a weird book. It's just a very unique book.
Yeah, and I think
not like another book.
Yeah, and I think because it's interesting, because in one sense it does have quite a conventional plot, or there is a kind of plot. And it's like the one thing I think I might disagree with you is about the site where I do feel there is quite an intense psychology to the book. Mm-hmm. So that while some characters are not given a huge interior life, I do think the main character of Celine, you do get quite a sort of deep presentation of her, but it's true, but in a kind of, I think the book tracks how she's trying to think. So while you don't always kind of know exactly her thought, it's trying to find a way, I think, of, especially for her, where this is a character who's in a world which feels very controlled by language, and I think that she's very much trying to find a different way of thinking and feeling that somehow. So I think I was often trying to find metaphors or similes that would reflect the way she was thinking, rather than maybe more conventional kind of ways of.
Right. I meant to say that what you're left with mainly, when you give up the other conventional means, is language and idea and obviously wit, and that's how the book rides. When I think that Celine does have a direction and an intellectual direction, and her drama is one of both trying to gain her own power of her own representation and how she thinks about the world and the universe. But what I meant is that you don't give her very much of childhood wounds and things that we could go back and decide this is why she's acting the way she's acting now. There's a little bit of her childhood, but you don't press the trauma button too much to explain why she's behaving. That's what I meant.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting what you talk about with verisimilitude, because I think with historical fiction, there's always this problem of research, almost, of kind of how far are you going to be completely accurate. And one of the things actually that I found quite interesting was often the moments, I think, in this novel that feel the most fantastical are actually often, I mean, not going to the moon, but apart from the moon, are actually quite grounded in historical fact. I'm trying to give it.
I assume the pamphlets are.
So the pamphlets are all, So I mean, I guess this book began because I was reading a book by an American historian called Robert Darnton, who wrote this book called something like the Underground Bestsellers of Pre-Revolutionary France, which I think is a very good title. And he describes this world of these pamphleteers who are living in London, these French pamphleteers living in London, and writing basically pornographic sort of stuff about rich women back in Paris. So this is just before the revolution. And for a while, I think it was when Brexit had just happened, and I was feeling particularly sad. And And I think so that my first kind of instinct was that maybe there was going to be a novel in these French writers living in London and taking advantage of London's kind of laxer censorship, or complete lack of censorship. And then got more and more interested by thinking, but actually I think this is more interesting if I kind of go from the point of view of one of the women being libeled. So so the pamphlets were all true. Most of the names are true.
I figured that the pamphlets were historically accurate. Yeah.
And they are but they were themselves fantastical because they're filled with mad kind of, they're very like a kind of crazy blog post now. So they're filled with utterly unsubstantiated allegation.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that quite attracted me about it was because they clearly, Darnton in this book says, there is one way in which you can argue these were crucial texts in the production of the revolution, because what was interesting was to discover that the kind of books that we associate with sort of paving the way to the revolution, like books by Voltaire or Rousseau or Diderot, in fact, no one was reading them. So they were selling almost nothing, whereas the books that everyone was reading were the porn. And he makes this very interesting argument where he says, maybe they, there's an argument that therefore by desacralizing so much these very rich, very powerful people, by just kind of making almost sort of fan fiction of these characters, that was actually a more significant sort of revolutionary move. And so I think I found something quite interesting in this idea of these writers telling themselves they were revolutionaries when really they were just having a fun time writing pornography.
I know what you mean when you say you have anxiety about writing historical fiction. When I did it myself, I didn't want to do it because I felt that it was very presumptuous of a writer to pretend that he or she knows what's going on 200 years before birth. So I had my narrator make it pretty clear that he's making it up. He's not lying. He's trying to tell the truth, but obviously he's not in possession of the truth.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's one reason for the style of this book, I think, was to try and sort of to give up some idea of authority on the past, to not say, I know exactly how this was. And I think to make a kind of argument of, because I think it seems to me there's two ways really of doing historical fiction. So one way is to try and, like say Daniel does, is to try and really find a way of putting the otherness of the past and show people with thought processes that are very alien to a 21st century sensibility. And I think I'm often, interested. I think, for a long while I was very interested in translation and often trying to collapse the idea that there could be sort of, that actually languages could communicate with each other. And I think here I was quite interested in thinking, well, maybe time frames can collapse as well. And maybe there is less difference than we might want to think between someone in 1775 and someone in 2023.
But that was a process of discovery as you wrote. Did you start with the pamphlets and think it's going to?
I started with the pamphlets and thought it would. Actually, then there's one of the main characters is Beaumarchais. He's obviously the real Beaumarchais.
Yeah.
And I found him just very funny because he was the archetypal kind of unsuccessful writer. So he basically was much more a hustler than a writer. So he was constantly doing schemes just to get rich, of which writing was just one of them. And he had a number of failed writing projects. And then what happened was that when these pamphlets were being such bestsellers, the French government basically turned to him and said, look, everyone trusts you back in London because you're such a failure. And so if we give you money, would you go across the channel and kind of buy them off, basically? Like if you buy up the print run and then give them 10,000 francs, whatever. Yeah. And then what I loved about Beaumarchais was that then he was such a hustler that he then did these deals with the pornographers. So he would say to the pornographers, we'll write back to the French government and invent titles that in fact don't exist, but we'll switch. So I will then say I need another 20,000 francs, and then we'll split the money. And then he was so successful at this that then the French government, it was just during the American Revolution, and the French wanted to get involved to help the Americans, but because of diplomatic niceties, they didn't want to annoy the British. And so Beaumarchais then became a gun runner to the American Revolution. So he set up a shell company under a Spanish name and called himself Rodrigue Hortales. and he basically shipped the guns. So the Battle of Saratoga was won because of his guns arrived in time.
That's all true in the book.
So that's all true, and that's in the book. Yeah. So you see, it's completely full of verisimilitude. This book.
Yeah.
And so for a while, I was just really interested in him as a figure, and then because then he went, and then I think it was just at a certain point I kind of thought this is too easily, like, he was a comic figure, and I felt slightly bored of him, and then kind of turned to Celine, basically.
Oh. Isn't there a line in the book, everyone likes Beaumarchais because he's unsuccessful, all the other writers like him because he's not successful? That brings up something I wanted you to read from page 26, which is about writers. Why don't you read it first and then see what you think of it.
So this is from a description of a party at which many writers are present.
Right.
They were obsessed by novelty and originality. They talked violently about everyone else's writing, and she understood that the only thing preventing them from talking violently about the writing of those present was the fact of their mutual presence itself. It was possible that this was only envy and therefore disgusting, but it was also possible that they felt a passionate attachment to literature as an ideal. Maybe, in fact, the two states were the same. They seemed to believe that it might be possible for a work to survive for many years, maybe even forever, as if a work that did not survive was therefore without value. And it was very strange to realize how passionately they believed this, that all value was linked to timelessness. For all of them, there was something very romantic in the idea of the future, and they believed that the way of entering a future existence was the production of works. Only a work could exist beyond the timescale of your lifetime. When someone mentioned a novel they were writing, Beaumarchais asked if what they were writing was total, all-out writing. He wanted everything in there, said Beaumarchais, because unless a writer was writing for their life, it wouldn't last forever. Someone else interrupted, asking in that case what Beaumarchais thought about form. Oh, form, Beaumarchais replied. He wanted that too. He wanted everything.
Is that a statement of purpose for yourself?
I mean, there are a lot of statements about writers that are quite mean in this book, and I think that that paragraph, I think it's not a statement of purpose, but I think it's something I'm genuinely interested in, which is how much time this idea of the future is bound up, I think, in a lot of the way writers. It seems to me that the passion with which people argue about how good a work is or how bad a work is, which in one sense is completely ludicrous given the kind of minuscule nature of the stakes. But something I think I find very lovable about writers and those who love writing is actually how much pressure is put onto writing. And so maybe it's slightly exaggerated here, but I think that idea that in fact a work that is truly great will live forever, will be read by generations, is clearly something built into our way of thinking about literature, I think. And I think I liked thinking, but actually so that there's therefore, in fact, traits in writers that can seem very unlikable, I think actually I took that joke, it was actually something from Ian McEwan, where I remember him saying to me that he was once with his generation of writers, and I think Ishiguro was the one not there, and everyone sat around being rather mean about Ishiguro's latest work. This is like 100 years ago, and then Ian had said to everyone, I've just, realized that we've all had these conversations about everyone present when each of them is not there, so I assume the same must be true when I am out of the room. And I think there's something genuinely innocent about it as well, so it looks kind of evil, as it were, this constant judging of other people's work. And actually, I think it comes from this strange, almost innocent belief that this thing has to be judged by a higher standard.
And if you don't, Ishiguro didn't join in on that, and that's why he won the Nobel.
And that's why he won the Nobel, that's the lesson of the story. Yeah.
Actually, remember, they always give it to the nicest person. Guy, You've touched upon it, so I don't want to reiterate. I think you've made clear the use of anachronism in the book, and you've already made clear why you did that. It's to sort of free yourself from the tyranny of the historical novel. So I don't want to get into that, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't touch on the correspondences between the printing press and these pamphlets and social media today, and the way one's image can be taken from one and distorted. Was that something that you were thinking a lot about, or did it just sort of happen as you were dealing with this material?
Yeah, I think more the latter. I think that it was one of the interesting things, I think, to me of the book was that it was almost liberated by this like deliberate anachronistic sentence structure, as it were. That as soon as I was in that space, suddenly it was very easy to not so much find parallels, but to sort of layer different time frames on top of each other, so that there was a definite correspondence. It's not in any way forced, basically, between the world of these pamphlets where I think the link actually is the anonymity of the writers. So the writers obviously were anonymous, so they couldn't be prosecuted or held to account in any way. And I was very interested in the way that was obviously replicated in a lot of the anonymous kind of posting or, unsubstantiated allegation that is kind of how a lot of social media functions. And I think there was I think maybe I'm getting old, and I'm more and more anxious by that kind of linguistic overproduction. And I think maybe as a novelist, I feel more and more conscious of that you're adding in this, there is suddenly this world where words are everywhere, and then a book is simply another addition to that world of words. And I think my anxiety is there any real difference, that I want the novel in some way to be a space where that kind of language gets diffused, or, that some of the danger of it or the violence of it can get held in suspension. And I guess the fear is that, in fact, the novel is just another addition to this miasma. So I think that concern about language was definitely, from the atmosphere around us. But it's not the other layer I think that I found very interesting was layering revolutions on top of each other. So this book kind of moves from before the revolution, through the revolution, and then afterwards. And actually a lot of so as well as sort of parallels between now and the 18th century, so the other thing that struck me a lot was how much different revolutions always use the same vocabulary. So the Russian Revolution uses, so there's a kind of a crucial interchange in the revolution where Beaumarchais by then is now seen as a reactionary and is taken to task by a younger radical. And I was kind of very interested in how I think some of the literal speeches that I used were actually taken from speeches during the Russian Revolution. And I just found it interesting, that amount of repetition, that obviously there are always specific differences, but I found it more interesting to find these kind of layers that were parallels.
In terms of the overproduction of language and the extent to which it gives you the willies, I think you handle it in a different way than other writers do, and in a much better way. I mean, reading this book is like watching a fireworks display. Things are going off all the time, brilliant bursts of color and light, and you see one, and then the next one comes, and you get mesmerized by all of them. I was reading the most recent novelist, Una Fosse, if I'm saying his name right. I don't know his work well, but I was reading some of septology,
Okay.
and I could see that, like a lot of writers now, he has that anxiety about whether language is hitting its target, and whether language is even a means of conveying truth at all. So he'll have what I consider to be tics in the sentences. He'll say, as they say, like maybe 5 times a page, so that any assertion is qualified. That's one way to register our common anxiety about language and its frailties. But you don't do that. I mean, this is a very beautifully written book. The language is never cowering in weakness. So that's not really a question, but can you speak to that at all? I mean, do you just try to go against it with your full power?
I guess so. I guess I kind of deep down believe that, if there's some utopian aspect to this book, it's to think the way in which to really counter this is if you construct a novel that is all-out writing, to quote Beaumarchais from the book, then in some way that will offer a different space and be a way of like letting language actually do what it should be doing. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think the linguistic theme actually, I think, surprised me at how strongly it emerged in the final book. And it's true though that I think I'm interested what you say about that kind of tick, because I think another tick I've noticed in a lot of contemporary writers is then you try and not name, if you're writing about the contemporary, you sort of try not to name Twitter or X. No, there's there's a weird kind of worry that if you name too many things, it'll be dated or somehow that's giving it too much power. And I think that was on my mind, I think, of how, this book was begun, probably before Brexit, but it was deeply coloured by that and the kind of atmosphere in Britain. And then I guess, the attendant problems in other countries. And I think that one attraction of this kind of going back to the 18th century was to think, well, there are ways in which I can talk about kind of problems of power or of nationalism or things that are excising me, but maybe I would be a little bit unsure as to how I would really put into a novel if it was in the pure contemporary right now. Like I didn't quite feel, I think I must have felt quite overwhelmed, and that this was a way of finding a way of writing about what was upsetting me or obsessing me, but in maybe a way that I felt I could have enough distance from. Yeah.
Well, you gave yourself total freedom, so you could do both at once, have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
When you're on a project like this, do you just sink your teeth in it and not let go like a pit bull, or do you work on something like this? Like what I do is I write for a while and I look ahead, what problems am I going to hit, and then I get scared and I despair and I put it away and then I try something else until that happens with that, and then I go back to the original one and I say, I know how to fix this now. So yeah. I have a number of skillets on the fire at any time until one really starts to sizzle. Do you work that way, or were you the whole time focused on this book and wrestling with it?
No, I think the composition of this book feels really exhausting. I mean, so I began it in probably, my last novel came out 100 years ago in like 2015. And then the first catastrophe that happened was we had a baby. And so I then, so I think I'd started it, but then had to put it aside for a while. Mm-hmm. Then I worked on a script of that novel that had just come out.
All right, yeah. That
went nowhere. So I kind of was using that. And then actually another project that again interrupted it was I developed a kind of piece, as you know, one of the things that really obsessed me is translation. And so a big festival in Britain called the Manchester International Festival had approached me and said, would you be interested in coming up with some kind of, performance piece that involves literature, because we've never done literature before. And so I had this then very strange experience of kind of inventing this performance piece with Rem Koolhaas, the architect, designing it to do with live interpretation and novelists. And so it was about the summer of 2019, so 4 years after beginning the project, that I thought I really now need to get back to this. I had probably about 20,000 words, and then the pandemic basically hit. And then I was homeschooling a by now 4-year-old. And so, and I think one of the things that I do think this is actually a very pandemic-y novel, because it feels a bit hallucinogenic to me in the same way as that period feels. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I was actually writing a lot of this book at sort of about 4:30 in the morning, because I was having to get up then before Rosa, our daughter, was waking up, and then because I knew for the rest of the day I'd be kind of with her. And so the book actually so I think some of the sorts of fireworks you're describing were a kind of related to that, the long gestation of the book.
I consider this single-minded, though. Everything you're describing, you're still working on this book.
Yeah, it was always the thing at the back of my mind. Yeah, and so... And I think some of the sort of almost complexity of the book is also from that long... I think that probably the book I might have first imagined in 2015 would not have necessarily involved a trip to the moon, as it were. And I think some of those decisions were partly because in that time, the book and myself had evolved, and so there were more things I wanted to put in. And I think my fear for that kind of length... I mean, you take your time too, so it's not just my fault. But is that you'll overload the project, that you'll lose the sort of single thing that was
right.
first was there.
Martin Amis told me once that every writer has this thing that they're known for, especially by journalists. His thing was he left his agent, got a big advance to fix his teeth because he had dental problems. And no matter what they wrote about him, they would always mention how he left his agent and fixed his teeth. And he said, what is your thing? And I said, my thing is that I'm slow. Like, no matter what, they'll ask me, why did it take you so long? Now, in preparing for tonight, I discovered that I think your thing is sex, it turns out. People are always mentioning sex, mainly because of your first book.
Yeah.
I don't think this book at all is very much about sex. I mean, there's sex in it, but do you feel like that label has gotten on you? Does it annoy you? My slow label annoys me, though it's perfectly true.
I think my other label is youth. There's a lot of people. I feel like everyone says,
what's better, youth or sex?
I mean, neither are true now.
Not at 4:30 in the morning.
And actually, maybe, so I think that, because it's interesting to me that this book, I think, is actually to do with aging. And weirdly, that was another reason why I wanted to do a historical novel, was because I wanted to have, it got more and more interesting to me to sort of describe, as it were, a 20-year period in someone's life and how they change or don't change and what changes around them. And that was definitely a very early, deep kind of thing that I wanted to do. And I knew, though, that I didn't really want to set a novel in 1980s Britain. That just wasn't doing it for me. And so I think just shifting entirely, so I had a kind of 40-year period that I could deal with, I think was clearly a way of trying to, I think this was me trying to write an old book and failing.
Well, maybe you'll wriggle free of the thing. I don't know how we're doing on time. I had a couple more questions, but I know we want questions from the audience. What? Okay. Let's see. Oh, you made me turn my phone off because it was making funny noises, so I have no idea. I wanted you to read one more piece on page 82, about the forest, which figures in the book so prominently. Then I just have a couple more questions, and we can open it up to the audience.
Okay, yeah, so there's a forest that kind of grows and grows during this novel, but having first had something terrible happen to it. That night, the forest caught fire. From her window, Celine could see the forest being orange, a sort of vast, smeared, rushing roar in the distance. She walked outside with Julia and Marta to try to look, but the heat was too intense. Everywhere, people were running with little buckets of water, cloths, large blankets. It was a communal process, the way the forest had always been maintained as a common space too. A line of workers was holding the flabby leather nozzle of a hose. Where it kinked on the ground, little eddies of water were leaking out. After some hours, they all went inside and began to cry, out of some kind of exhaustion and animal terror. Then Celine went upstairs and listened to the emergency services shouting through the night. The next morning, they went out to see what had happened. They had managed to save large expanses, people said, but some areas of forest were gone. As they walked through these empty patches, the sounds were different, clearer and with less background. Everything was reduced and grey and sensitive. A lake was now visible, which had not been visible before, from a certain hilltop. They walked for a little while, then they turned to go back home. In the burnt grass, an exposed toad was throbbing hysterically, like a terrified heart.
That must have been a nice day writing that last line. I'm going to contradict what I said before. I think there is a plot and development with regard to Celine, and I mentioned it a little bit. It has to do with getting power of her image, but it goes beyond that finally. It's not that schematic. Finally, I think she gets beyond such Foucauldian obsessions. But there is a fair amount of material in the book about power structures, who has the power, how it's used. Mm-hmm. And Celine, of course, at the end, ends up, can I give things away or not?
I think you can't give that away.
I can't. Okay. Well, she ends up doing something that probably is the greatest power grab in the history of novels. You'll have to read the book to get there. But I'm wondering if I have a question left now. Well, I mean, what can you say about Celine's trajectory in terms of her power and what you wanted to say about power in society?
Yeah, so I guess it begins. I think what I was really interested in was that it begins with a very traumatic episode, as it were, for her, which is the experience of being written about by people she doesn't know and being, libeled, essentially, like untrue things being said about her without her having any control. And so that begins this very long process for her of trying out almost different solutions to how to sort of get power back, or not even necessarily power, I think, but also to just find her own sense of well-being and her own sense of self and of happiness. And I think that, so it's figured in different ways. There's partly that she has different men at different periods of her life attacking her for different reasons. And sometimes the same men, which again was historically true. That one of the things I found very funny was that a number of these pamphleteers then did become quite prominent members of the revolutionary government, so that they simply switched from being the people sort of writing anonymous stuff in London to actually having genuine power and then getting executed by their friends. And so at different points she's attacked for different things and has to therefore kind of find a new way out. And sometimes she tries, via sort of getting her own writers on side, as it were. Sometimes I think she tries it through friendship, and I was very interested, I think, in that sense of solidarity in the friendship between her and her friends, and the way of trying to therefore resist through a relatively private way a very large external sort of structure. But I think the real kind of movement of this book is for her is moving away both from wanting overt power like that, and also really believing that language is the route to it. And so I think that what I kind of, and I think again it's related maybe to this thing, I think that the question for me of kind of growing older, and it's something actually that another mutual friend of ours, A.D. Smith, said to me when we were both writing historical novels, and that there's something very moving, I think, as you get older, of kind of not being so angry with your contemporaries, so that you sort of, by the very fact that you have aged together, you develop a kind of affection for that your own generation, that if that sort of, there's a sense of having lived through something together, however much there may have been many arguments kind of en route. And I think for Celine, that sense of time is what kind of gets more and more interesting for her. And so I think the kind of, her relationship to power changes, so I think that she no longer wants something she thought she wanted, or no longer also thinks that what she wants is located in a certain place. And I was quite, and one of the other things that that clearly marked this book, as I've described it, was kind of my daughter growing up. And I think that there's, the passage of time described between her and her own daughter was, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I felt that the book transcends the preoccupation with power, especially at the end.
Yeah.
And with the relationship between Celine and Saratoga, her daughter. And I felt Rosa's presence in the book pretty strongly, because I know she exists, and I know she was young while you were writing. I didn't know you were up at 4:30 every morning writing the book before she woke up. But can you, just in closing our part of the conversation, could you talk about the figure of Saratoga, and the book ends with her and ends with Celine together, and it ends with them in the forest, the restored forest. The last line, in fact, is green, and Celine becomes green. It all comes together, both her as a mother and her as entering the forest, and maybe that's a place we could end.
Yeah, I think it becomes, so she has this kind of child, which I think when she has a child with a man who's not her husband, and a man she doesn't want to have any kind of relationship with, and so she's becomes, as it were, almost a single mother, which again, I think, is relatively, I think this was happening in that kind of class in the 18th century. There were constant children being put in different houses in the countryside to be kind of brought up and then said that they were somebody's cousin or kind of. And so at first Saratoga is a relatively kind of minor presence in the book, and then gradually kind of becomes more and more important to both the book and to Celine. And I think it's interesting. It sort of relates back to, if the novelists in this book are all thinking about timelessness in a very almost narcissistic way, they're thinking of their own timelessness. And I think that in one way, this book is definitely trying to kind of, or Celine is trying to find a way out of time, or to sort of find some kind of, it's as if for her, like, true happiness is not going to be in the contemporary moment. Like, she stops caring so much about the contemporary moment. And I think the sort of almost the way this is for her is in the love she feels for her daughter. And I think in the sense of that there is therefore, it's like a giving up of control, I think. That I think a lot of this book is Celine trying to take control. And by the end, I think she's no longer interested in that kind of control. And I think the sort of figure of, as it were, Saratoga disappearing into the distance is the kind of way in which the novel ends, and I think is the way, for me, is the image of her happiness.
Yeah. The sequence on the moon precedes the ending, but the ending feels just as much of a flight and an ascension away from the world that she's been enmeshed in, and I thought toward nature as well.
Yeah, so it kind of ends with her that she's now living in the forest. In a not just sort of wild in the forest, in a small house in the forest, which is now sort of, well, this small house now belongs to her, and I think the sort of last few scenes are definitely as fantastical in a way. They're kind of her. It's as if all the voices from the novel, all the voices from her past, and now it's like as if she's kind of hallucinating dead people, living people in a kind of conversation. And maybe that is my kind of ideal of happiness, is that kind of, there was this, because I think in the book, conversation is very much seen as one way of finding a way of language that is better than writing, as it were. That, like, there's an ideal of conversation where in that kind of dialogue between people, true sort of self-knowledge is found, but also true happiness. And so she's then kind of almost in this kind of soundscape of snippets from the kind of that she's lived through. And it is true that it was so that I think, the forest becomes more and more almost a character in this book. That it starts just as something that is kind of just a landscape that some characters are in, and then it acquires more and more importance for her and for the novel. So that the novel eventually, I think, is, and I guess it's this kind of concern with something that's not linguistic, that there is another form of living which is maybe, as interesting but not human.
We call that moving upstate.
She basically does move upstate, yeah.
Right. All right, I'd like to open the evening up to questions from the audience. It's a pretty small room, so you probably will be able to be heard, I think. They actually have a mic.
For both of, I don't need a mic. I speak loudly. When you have an idea for a book, if you don't mind sharing, do you kind of write out your idea, like 4 or 5 pages of like the general idea for the book, and then move on to the actual writing of the book, or what is your process, if you don't mind sharing?
I wish that was my process. It would solve so much. No, I think I tend to begin with a kind of scene or an image that interests me, and then sort of burrow my way out. And so I certainly don't know where I certainly don't have an idea of a pure structure. So I think that gradually I get to a structure, then I kind of, the writing then makes you realize that structure is not going to work, so then you go back. So I'd say it's a kind of trial and error process where you, or certainly for me, where I kind of write some scenes and whatever seems right, and then realize that that's going to have to, and then often I think you find one or two paragraphs even where you think it's working, and then you kind of work out, okay, well, if that's working, now I need to jettison most of the rest and start again from the beginning. So I don't know, maybe you have a perfect scene-by-scene layout.
No, I think the way you do it is a good way to do it, because when you try to come up with an outline before you've written the book, the ideas you have for the book are the most commonplace ones that will occur to you. And as you're writing the book and living in the book, you think of better things, less cliche ideas. Sometimes I'll write out where the story's going just to make myself feel better so that I'm not completely at sea.
Yeah.
But I always throw that away. So any blueprint is provisional.
I mean, I'm a big believer in stationery as well. I have a lot of kind of colored pencils and pads which are there to basically, I do like doing very schematic kind of colored outlines, which in fact bear no relation.
It's comforting.
Yeah, it's comforting. But it's true, actually with this novel I was making myself laugh, where I found a number of emails from me to my agent from about 2018 onwards, each time saying, yeah, the book's going to be done in 3 months. And then 9 months later, it was going to be done in another 3 months. And then eventually 4 years later, it was actually finished.
Thank you. You talked, you might be using the phrase trial and error here again, but you talked earlier about knowing what level of depth to go to in research for historical fiction. I wonder if you could talk about that at all in terms of when you know you've reached that right level. And you mentioned Zadie Smith earlier and her novel, and she wrote a piece recently about having exactly the same trepidation about this, and I'd love to know kind of when you know you hit that sweet spot.
Yeah, I don't know if you ever did. With historical fiction, I think you have this terror of the historian who is going to mark your homework. And I think that...
The ex-military person is worse.
Yeah.
Actually, B-52 had,
Well, and I think... But I'm sure that was also one protective reason for the anachronism, was just thinking, well, if I just multiply anachronism, then I'm unimpeachable. I don't know, so I did, and I guess, it began just because, I happened to be reading this one work of history that I just really enjoyed and found very interesting. And then I feel still that, my reading for it was a little haphazard. I certainly don't feel I'm some expert on this period. On the other hand, I did read a huge amount. And I think, I don't know what the sweet spot is. I guess it's just whenever you feel you've got enough for your uses. I don't know. It's a kind of... So I wouldn't say I still don't feel confident that I kind of either did enough or did I do too much. I think that's the other fear, is that you'll get so much detail. And I do think I probably... there was a version of this that my editor luckily helped me reduce, where there were so many different small anecdotes and characters, because I was just sort of almost too steeped in this material, and there were stories that were just fun, and so you'd want to include them just because they were making me laugh. There was a whole pirate sequence that I very much regret. So I think that you never really know, and I think in the end, like with all research novels, whether or not they're historical or in the present day, I think, you still have to find what's the novel in it, and there might be a way in which a much more lightly researched book might work better, or work, I think that you have to find whatever is the novel there. I don't know, do you agree?
I agree. I think sometimes research will give you an idea for where to go with the book, too.
I think the advantage of research is that you will always find amazing tiny details. Partly, again, I think one of the things, for instance, that to me in this book seems completely made up is there's a moment during the revolution where there is a clerk in the... I invent a name of a committee, but in the Committee for Public Safety, which was basically sort of the guillotining committee. And there's this clerk, and this is a completely true story, who loved theatre, And he one day discovered that the entire staff and production personnel of the Comédie Française was going to be executed in a week's time because they'd put on a play that the revolutionists didn't like. And so what he did was he realized that, and I think this is just interesting to me generally, that this was like, the revolution was one of the first sort of bureaucratized revolutions. So everything was written down. And he therefore realized that if you removed the paper, then the revolution didn't function. So what he did was there was a bucket of water kept to chill the wine for the Committee for Public Safety. So he would use this bucket, because the pieces of paper were far too big for him to just remove in his pockets. So he soaked them in the water, sort of then kind of crumpled those up so they were little pellets of paste. He then put those in his pockets, walked out of the office, and then went to a bathhouse down the road and pushed them out the bathroom window into the river. And this is a completely true story, which is then discovered by two journalists about 20 years later, who discovered him living in total poverty. And very beautifully, the Comédie Française then put on a benefit performance for him, where he got the whole proceeds. And so that's in the novel, and that's a true story. Interestingly, I also believed, I had in my notes, that he swallowed these pieces of paper. And so that is what happens in the novel. And then it was only just quite recently, I was kind of putting stuff away, and then I found that, in fact, that's because there's a character in an Abel Gance movie where a character swallows paper, so I'd completely conflated a character in a movie with this true story, but basically it's true. And I think that's a fun aspect of the research, is you discover these things that I would never have made up, but partly was so useful because this novel is so much about language and its relationship to power. So the idea that paper itself basically had the power of life and death, it was beautiful to me. But I guess I think if I'd thought to invent that, I'd have thought that was too schematic almost.
What about the Washington parts?
I think most of the Washington is true.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah, bad man. Yeah.
Other questions?
As a mom, I love how you describe the ending scene. I think that's amazing. The loss of control and what happens when you have children. It happens to all of us. What are you reading with Rose these days?
That's a good question. So these days, she's very into detective mysteries. So there's this series, I don't know if they're here, there's a writer of basically Agatha Christie for 9-year-olds. And they're kind of about they're set in a kind of girls' school, like an imaginary 20s girls' school. And she very much likes those. And actually, I have a very good friend, he's a very well-known children's writer in Britain called Catherine Rundell. He's recently just brought out a huge best-selling new fantasy book for kind of Rosa's age group. And Rosa was very excited about this, but was most excited because she was told that this author, whose name I've completely forgotten now, was going to be there at the launch. So in a way that I thought was so brilliant, that she goes to another author's launch clutching about 8 of this other writer's books, hoping that they would get signed, and spends the entire time, because we didn't know what she really looked like, and so we had to go around this party like asking after this author. And I thought that was a very cool move at someone else's launch party to be. So she's reading that, and she's very into Tintin now. Tintin is her new thing. So it's now interesting, because there are books that she wants to read with us and books she wants for herself, and I think that's also quite an interesting movement of like actually wanting to almost have things that are private to her, and that she literally doesn't want us to read, and then having books that she wants to read together.
With Helen, I'm reading a very important book right now called Diapers Are Not Forever.
So it's true. Yeah.
I hope it's true.
Yeah.
There were 2 here, I think. Yeah.
Same question for both of you. Why do you write?
That's just for him. I'm just a wingman.
Oh God. Yeah, someone asked me recently, like, what was my literary project, and I thought, I don't know. I don't know what the impulse is to write. I mean, I think that I'm surprised by how early I think from almost the age of 12, that's what I wanted to be, a thing called a writer, but I don't know what that meant, because I wasn't thinking through what it actually meant to get up at 4:30 in the morning to write some pages. I'm sure part of it is a genuine delight in language and trying to do things with language. I get a huge pleasure from that, and I think that but I don't know the kind of, it must be some way of coping, I think, and processing and kind of, I feel if I were a better person, I'd be able to be more direct, as it were, with myself and those I love, and I wouldn't need to write. Or sort of, there's some way in which the kind of, the writing is a way of, I don't know, orienting myself or finding a way of writing about things that I couldn't talk about, but I can build this weird model and then offer it to other people.
Garcia Marquez said he wrote in order to be loved more.
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. Yeah.
Was there another one here, or was that? Okay,
Have you noticed how long it takes you to get enough distance to know what to cut out?
Well, I think, yeah, I really enjoy actually cutting. I think that, yeah, I found a quote recently by a Latin American writer, Julio Ramon Ribera, who is a Peruvian writer, and he had this beautiful thing where he said that everyone thinks that writing is kind of the accretion of sentences, as it were, and the kind of, and actually what it is it's the cutting them away. It's like, it's kind of, and I really like this idea that it was kind of like pruning a tree. And that's certainly how I write, is that I always overwrite, as it were, and then find a lot of the interest is then in the editing. So I don't know, so partly, you rely on your actual editors, and I think that, but also, I think, yeah, I quite like it. I mean, I remember there's an anecdote of Picasso that I've always really loved, where someone said that, he produced so many paintings, but also the thing that was amazing about him was that there could be a painting that he'd literally just finished in the morning, and by the afternoon he was quite happy to change it, that he had no sense of sort of ownership over this thing. He was completely almost detached from it. And I think that's I never, I still get very hurt and upset when things are cut. But yeah, my pirate novel will be coming out very soon. Yeah, so I think the ideal is to sort of not be. I think this is one thing that's really interesting about writing. It goes to the question about why I write, is that it's this weirdly hybrid situation where it's intensely personal and private and secretive in ways that even are secret to you, and it's almost a game, as it were. And to find the right way of balancing those, I think, is very hard.
Hi. When you spoke earlier about the nature of social media, it's something that I often think about, the preciousness of words and kind of like the insurgence of everything, and how to, I don't know if there is a remedy for it, if there is a solution. And I'm personally someone that I think a lot about, where's like the future of like writing movements or art movements, if like it's all in this like invisible space, and are people still congregating, and how are we sharing ideas, because there's so much, and having so much is good, but having so much is also hard to keep track of. So I guess someone who loves to write, and how I love to write, and clearly you both love to write, maybe there isn't a solution, but is there something you can think of for generations, younger generations or generations now, how to maintain like the preciousness of that language? And what are your thoughts on where that's going in the future?
Yeah, I think that, it's obviously, I don't know what, one of the things I think I'm very wary of is making predictions. I feel very like no prediction really works out. I think I'm interested in sort of, partly I guess it's different modes of almost circulation. So I can think, it interests me how you could make, a book into a performance, or a live conversation, like, as it were, like this. They seem to me really important. Or more small scale kind of it doesn't always have to be a mass-produced book. Maybe there could be smaller. There's certainly a way in which I really miss that kind of Renaissance thing where someone would just pass their manuscript around among 10 friends. That seems to be like a really civilized way of doing writing. So yeah, but I guess I'd still believe in the book. I mean, like actually the physical book. There's a curator friend of mine who's always very fond of saying that a book is the best form of exhibition possible. Because it's so small scale and easy to produce and actually has so much inside it and is so portable. And I really love that idea of a book as an exhibition and kind of that. So I think that I'm very old-fashioned, so I think I really love the sort of tactility of a book and the being able to physically flip amongst it. So I guess because part of the way I write is because I'm very interested, I think, in almost collage and putting different things together and seeing kind of what happens when apparently disparate things are put next to each other. So I think, therefore, the literal physicality of the book still seems to me as quite a radical operation. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on this one? No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.